This is segment 2 of our discussion about the federal budget process. So let's take a look at federal spending and the deficit. As we go through this video, we'll see a couple of things. One, the question is, what do we spend money on, and how much of that is actually able to be controlled by members of Congress and the president? Second of all, we'll take a look at a couple of the big non-discretionary programs like Medicare and Social Security, and look at them in the future and what their capacity for sustaining themselves are. And then finally take a look at the deficit and the interest on the debt as we go through. So let's take a look at these subjects now. So just as a quick overview, I want to mention here that statistics are very unevenly available and produced by different agencies and by different nonprofit organizations that study the budget. So I'm weaving in and out here through a number of different years, but a year or two really probably doesn't make that much difference as far as these things are concerned. I try to have the most recent stuff available for you. Here's the federal budget as of 2018. Now, there was $4.1 trillion budget, okay? $4.1 trillion. We brought in $3.3 trillion, and we'll talk more about the revenue side in the next video. Let's examine a little bit about these outlays. That's about 20.3% of our GDP, or our gross domestic product, which is our way of kind of saying, how large is the economy? And one way that you're going to see a lot of stats in the course of this and some other videos is that we use GDP because as the economy grows, it doesn't necessarily make sense just to talk dollar-to-dollar terms, but rather what percentage of the economy are each of these programs over time. So you'll see here that the dark blue line in the circle accounts for those things that are mandatory spending. So the largest single program in the American federal budget at the national level is Social Security, with a little under $1 trillion worth of spending, which puts it at around 1/4 of the overall federal budget. The second largest category that we would see here is defense, and that is what we consider to be a non-discretionary program. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then we have Medicare, Medicaid. Healthcare costs together between these two programs end up being the largest total program if you combine Medicare and Medicaid. And what we see here is also there's a sizable chunk of the federal budget that's taken up with what we call the net interest. So if we are borrowing, about $23 trillion is where our deficit is right at the present time. We're borrowing $23 trillion from somebody, we've got to give them interest or else they're not going to lend us the money. So in any given year, we're paying about $325 billion in interest on that debt. We're not going to talk a whole lot about state and local expenditures here, but I did want to give you some context as to the differences between the federal budget and the state budgets and local budgets as well. So, we saw the three big programs for the federal government being Social Security, Defense, and Medicare and Medicaid. We have a very different system here at the state and local level. So this is the blue columns are state level. You see that public welfare is the #1 source of expenditure for state governments. And that is, for the most part, related to Medicaid, which is the program for poor Americans to get health care. That is quickly outstretched education as being the top source of expenditures for state governments. On the other hand, you see in the left-hand corner with the yellow column is that elementary and secondary education is the largest single expenditure for local governments, and about 40% of all their expenditures go towards that. As far as state government spending in relationship to education, mostly state spending goes towards higher education in the United States. And then various other things such as public safety, highways, health are other categories. But the big things are education and healthcare at the state level. So let's take a look at a quick kind of pie chart that shows you just how much of the federal budget is on autopilot at any given year. So mandatory programs are those programs in which Congress has agreed through prior legislation that anybody who pays into that system or meet certain eligibility thresholds will be able to get money from those programs. And you'd have to change the legislation in order to be able to change the amount of money being spent on that. So again, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and various other things. That accounts for 62% of the overall federal budget, which really can't be changed from year to year. Add into that the idea that the interest on the debt accounts for 8% of the budget, and we can't really default on that or decide we don't want to pay for that. So what you end up with here is about 70% of the federal budget is really not really negotiable from one year to the next unless Congress makes some big changes in the way it funds its mandatory programs. That means that there's only about 30% or so of the budget that could be tinkered with, and half of that is in defense, which is very difficult to cut for political reasons. So we've got a budget deficit of over $1 trillion with a budget of about $4 trillion. So when you're looking at this, if you basically cut almost all the discretionary funding out of the federal budget, you'd be able to balance the federal budget. That would mean no defense, no roads, no support for higher education, and so forth. Now, one of the things that we see as we look forward to the gradual evolution of the budget in prior and future and prior years is that this mandatory spending has expanded exponentially and become a much bigger part of the federal budget. So Social Security started in the Great Depression. Medicare, Medicaid came along during the Great Society programs in the 60s. But they were greatly expanded as we went through time. So if you take a look back to 1968, those mandatory spending programs only accounted for a little bit over a quarter of our overall spending. By the time we get to 1993, they account for a little bit less than half. And around current times, as we saw, they're in the 60s and will probably remain there, growing a little bit in the future. But what that means is that Congress has much less leeway to be able to balance the budget by cutting non-discretionary programs, which went from 66% in 1968 down to about a quarter of the budget when we look a little bit forward into 2028. And this is the Concord Coalition, who are more or less kind of balanced budget type organization using data from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, one thing to take a look at here as well is what the overall net interest on the debt is going to look like as we move forward. So while it was about 7-8% in temporary times, by the time we look forward to 2047, it's going to account for about 21% of overall spending in the United States for the federal government. Think about that for a second. 1/5 of the federal budget is not going to go to any specific program other than just paying off interest on these loans, the debt that we have going forward. And if you take a look at the right side of the chart, the growth in net interest is really big. Also, looking forward out to 2047, what we'll see is that healthcare will become a much bigger part of the federal budget, going from about 28% to 40%. And all this spending on interest on the debt and healthcare means that non-discretionary funding is just going to become a smaller and smaller and smaller part of the overall pool. So let's take a look at the specific areas in which we have mandatory spending. So at the top, I did mention that Social Security is the largest single program for the federal government, but when you add up Medicare and Medicaid together, they top $1.1 trillion per year. So they are combined. Healthcare is the largest single source spending for the federal government. Social Security and its corollary SSI, disability insurance, account for almost $1 trillion as well. Then we talk about other types of income security programs. So for example, the Earned Income Tax Program, which we'll talk a little bit about at a later time, essentially helps people that are poor by giving them money back for the amount that they earn. We also have things like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is our equivalent of a food program for people that are poor, unemployment compensation, and so forth. We also have retirement programs for federal employees as well as the military. Also considered in mandatory spending are those programs for veterans. And then we have a number of other programs as well. What about discretionary spending? Well, we usually divide discretionary spending into two categories. The first is defense, and the second is non-defense. And what you see is that those two categories are pretty much equally divided and split in half. So we have about a little bit over $1.2 trillion being spent on discretionary spending, and about half of that goes to defense, half to non-defense. And then you see the various types of categories that we have here. So education, transportation, veterans, health, some other health programs, and various other things that fall into this. So essentially, all of the spending pretty much outside of entitlement programs, which constitute Social Security, which constitute healthcare, and outside of defense, account for about $639 billion. Looking forward, again, this is another way to examine how we can take a look at comparisons over time of how big these mandatory programs have actually gotten. So these are projections or retrospective looks at these programs as a percentage of the economy or the GDP. So if you take a look at Social Security back in 1970, it was only 2.8% of the overall economy. As we look forward to 2030, it will become 6%, the equivalent of 6% of the overall economy. Again, realizing that we have the baby boomer generation, which is retiring, and that's why Social Security will go up. Also, major healthcare, going from a little less than 1% of overall the economy in 1970, going up to over 7% in 2030. Then go back to the discretionary outlays, and what you'll see is that your defense used to be the single largest thing in the federal government at 7.8% of the overall economy in 1970. That will drop by 2030 to 2.8%. And then non-defense, again, that little tiny slice of about 600 billion, that's ironic to say that little slice of 600 billion, but $600 billion, that little slice of the pie that Congress can really play around with will fall from 3.7% of our overall economy down to about 2.8%. And the net interest will continue to rise as well. And if you take a look at the full overall picture in the right-hand corner, overall, government has grown substantially since the 1970s, going from about 18.7% of our economy to a projected 23.4% by the time we hit 2030. Now, let's just step back for 1 second and talk a little bit about some of the problems that we have with the budget, particularly with these mandatory costs, which we can't really change. And two of the big programs that we're looking at here are Social Security and Medicare. So if you take a look at this here, OASDI is old age survivors and disability insurance, and HI here is Medicare. So as we look forward to the future, you're going to see here that there is essentially been a period of time, particularly for Social Security, that in the 1980s, there was more revenue being taken in or more income than it was costing. And that was because Congress and the Reagan administration in the early 80s realized that the baby boom were going to cause a big problem for paying out Social Security. So they raised Social Security taxes and then decided to save that money for the point at which we would have the baby boomers retire. Now, they didn't really save that money, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. They basically used that to cover up the deficit, but that's a story we'll talk about again. But as you see going forward from about late 2019 into 2020, what we're seeing is that the cost for Social Security overall is going to outstrip the income for Social Security. And that's okay because we can, to some extent, have this money that's built up in the Social Security Trust Fund, but that is going to run out as well. And then we're going to have serious problems paying for both of these programs. So here's some key dates for these trust funds. As we look at this, we can take a look at two facets of Social Security, which is old age and survivors benefits, disability insurance, and then the combined old age and survivor benefits and disability. And then finally on the right-hand corner is Medicaid, Medicare. So for the first time in 2010 for Social Security, what we saw was that the expenditures exceeded the income coming in, not including interest that the government was paying itself. Now, what we see in 2020, this is the first time that all the income that we get from both money that we're making off of the trust fund that was established in the 1980s, as well as income coming in from Social Security, we are now seeing that the costs are exceeding income. And by the year 2034, the amount of money that we have in the Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted. As you see here, the situation for disability insurance is a little bit better. It's much more solvent than is the old age or the normal Social Security and survivors. And the whole way to the right, we see that the Medicare trust fund is not doing quite as well. So long term, we're going to have to do something about this in order to be able to control deficits and to be able to pay out what we've promised to the people that paid in to both the Social Security system and into the Medicare system as well. And the problem is, if we don't find a way to control those costs, that money that's been promised is not coming out of Social Security payments, but it's going to have to come out of our general budget, which probably means an increase in taxes of some sort. So as we see here, this is the total budget deficit as it's been shown over the recent several decades. We're looking into 2030. And what you've seen for the most part is in recent American history, we've been running budget deficits pretty much at an ongoing pace. The only point in time in which we really didn't have budget deficits over the last several decades was in the mid to late 90s into early 2000 before the recession of 2001. And that was partially because of some tax increases at the early part of the Clinton administration and also some balanced budget efforts by George H.W. Bush as well. But for the most part, we've been running budget deficits since then. And just to show you what that looks like, I'll take a look at the U.S. debt clock. And this, you can go to this at any point that you want. Oh, wrong one. And this is an interesting debt clock because it basically shows us on a second-by-second basis how much debt we have. So right at the present moment, there's $23,617,502,450,000 worth of debt. And that accounts to $71,683 per U.S. citizen and that would include children. So it's almost 190, it's a little more than $190,000 per taxpayer. So every taxpayer in this country basically owes about $200,000 because of the federal debt. That would buy, a nice little vacation home for you somewhere up in the Poconos. So going forward, this is an accounting by the Center for Responsible Federal Budget of how much we're going to see an increase in areas of the budget going forward. And what you'll see is that the net interest on the debt will eventually, by the year 2026, become one of the largest sources of expenditures for the federal government. Now, here's the question. We've got all this debt, $3 trillion. Where does it go? In other words, who owns that debt? So the government's basically saying we don't have enough money to be able to pay for our budget. And then they go out to the markets and they say, hey, we want you to lend us money. And who's buying this debt? Who's lending the federal government the money? Well, this is the most recent full figures that we have, and they're from the Treasury Department back in September 2019. And the deficit, as you can see here, was about, not quite $1 trillion, about $750 billion less than it is right now. But we had a total federal government debt at that point of $22.7 trillion. And $14.7 trillion was held by the public. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. So 65% was held by the public. And here's what's very interesting. $8 trillion was held by the US federal government. Right? So think about this for a second. 35% of all the federal debt is owned by the federal government. Let that sink in for a second. Again, it's like you saying, I'm going to borrow 1/3 of all my debt from myself. And mostly with that program, most of that is in the Social Security Trust Fund, which was invested in United States treasuries. So a lot of our debt from the federal government is actually owned by the federal government itself. Now, what about those public owners of the debt? This is as an overall 100 percentage point of 100% of all the federal debt. About 30% is owned by U.S. investors, whether they be individuals or whether they be banks or whether they be insurance companies or any type of a firm that might buy that as an investment product. About 4.8% of all the federal debt is owned by state and local governments. Part of that is in pension plans for state and local employees. Again, this is a very safe bet. Treasury bonds are not going, hopefully not going to go bankrupt. And frankly, if the federal government goes belly up, there's more problems in the economy than we would hope to have. One thing that concerns some people is the fact that 30% of the federal debt is owned by foreign investors. 5% is owned, if you take a look at the countries where the debt comes from, either through corporations or individuals, or in some case, what we call a sovereign wealth fund. 5% of all the foreign debt is owned by Japan, and 4.9% is owned by China. So that's who owns the debt. And that's our overview of the process of what we spend our money on at the federal level.